My name is Stuart Servitar, and I'm going to give you a talk about the SSAT, the SHSAT, the ISEE, and the SSAT. Mostly it'll be about the SHSAT, but I'll give you a little rundown on the ISEE and the SSAT, because who knows where we'll all be next fall. Thank you for joining me. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel is our wonderful operations manager. She has kept this company running on her strong shoulders since forever now, it feels like. I'm going to, whoops, I just lost my screen. I'm going to share with you a classic PowerPoint. I'm not going to bore you by reading it directly. I'm going to kind of break it down as I go, and hopefully it will be informative and potentially entertaining. We'll see about that. Let me see what I can do here. Slideshow. All right. So the SHSAT, ISEE, and SSAT, what are they? How do they differ? Which, if you don't know, you should take, and why. And then we're going to break down a little bit about the tests, because there is so much misinformation and confusion, and quite frankly, a lot of details about each test. Obviously, there's not going to be a test at the end of this, so you don't have to remember all this, but hopefully you'll get a clear idea of what your student is in for next fall and winter. And as Rachel said, if you have questions, you can shoot it to her in the chat, and either she'll handle it as they come up, or we'll have a questions at the end for you all to ask me directly. In case you don't know, I'm Stuart Servitar. I founded ibidPREP a million years ago, and I've been tutoring for 2 million years. And we've been housed on the Upper West Side since 2012. And we've worked with thousands of kids from hundreds of schools, but mostly Upper West Side, Upper East Side, downtown, Brooklyn Heights, some of those kids from the Bronx. And we've all helped them get into the great middle schools, great high schools, and great colleges. And we have a very set kind of philosophy that I've developed in all my hundreds of years of tutoring. And that's the basis of the Remain Clam series of test books, which if you don't know about them, I'll be kind of dropping a little information about that as we go. But for now, let's just get to the tests. Oh, we rushed ahead. Is the SHSAT right for you? That's the first question you want to ask. The SHSAT is obviously a test to get you into the specialized high schools. And it's a test that, if you don't know any 8th graders right now, it's driving them crazy because it's a crazy test, and it's been given 3 months later than normal. So it's even crazier. And as we know, everything's crazy right now. But the one thing to remember about this test is to remain clam, because it's a much different test from what kids are used to. The math is harder than what most of they've been taught, and the reading is to a much higher level. But the great news is you don't have to be perfect on this test. It's not like getting on the high honor roll or getting on A+ or straight A's. Most scores don't even have to be in the 80s to get into a specialized high school. So that's much different from what your wonderful, perfect students are used to. And getting used to not doing so well on a test takes a lot of getting used to, as does the timing. But the good news is, if you get around a 70% or up on this test, I wrote 65%, that may be a little under exaggeration, but if you get anywhere from 70% up on this test, correct, roughly, you can get into a specialized high school. So that's a good reason to give it a shot. And should you take it? Meaning your student, if they're out there listening as well. I say yes, because especially nowadays, it's the one opportunity your student will have to exert control over this process. Every school is changing. They're changing their rubrics. We might not even know the rubrics for next year, but the idea is on this test, if you get a certain score and it's good enough, you get a certain school. If you pick that school first and you clear that cutoff, you get it. If not, you get the second one on your list, and so on down the list. So it gives you control over what is right now a very hectic process, and always has been, to be honest. Another reason, it's only 3 hours. So why not take a shot? The third reason is it's free. And that's a good thing. The last reason, obviously, is that your head will not explode if you do poorly. A lot of kids put a lot of stress, and maybe some parents put a little pressure on them about this test, and it feels like their heads might explode, but they don't. We've never lost a kid yet. So take a shot on this test. Now, if this specialized school process is not for you, if those schools are not, any one of them don't appeal to you, don't bother, because it can be a difficult process. It can be a stressful process. But if you think you have any kind of shot and any kind of interest in these schools, obviously it's worth a shot. Now, on the flip side, and what I'm adding into the talk for you guys today is information on the ISEE and the SSAT. And those are just the schools you take if you're going to also or only be applying to a private school. Most schools, private schools, take both. It tends to be that the boarding schools prefer the SSAT. The ISEE usually goes to the New York City private schools. But again, you'll have to check whatever your list of schools is and see which one they prefer. But normally, again, if you're going in city, you take the ISEE. If you're going out of town, if you're shipping your kids off to Connecticut or Massachusetts or Louisiana, they'll probably take the SSAT. What is the SHSAT? Good question, Stuart. Thank you. The SHSAT is a 114 question test that's given over 3 hours. Students are free to use those 3 hours however they choose. Meaning, although the test starts with the verbal section, you can start with the math section. Each section has exactly 57 questions. Why 57 and not 50? There are 7 extra verbal questions and 7 extra math questions that are not graded. They are used for future tests. So if there's a super weird question on your test, perhaps it's an experimental question. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about anything, but don't worry about those. The verbal section is broken down into 2 types of questions. One's called revising and editing, which secretly means grammar and editing. Many schools don't teach grammar so much or at all anymore. That does not stop tests from testing kids on grammar and editing. So they'll need to learn a little bit of that. If they learn it well, if they learn it cogently, that could be as many as 12 easy points for them. Otherwise, it could be kind of a nightmare way to start the test. The rest of the verbal is good old-fashioned reading comprehension, which they've had on the state tests since 3rd grade, but to a much higher level. They have to read for main idea, analysis, inference, all those good things, and detail, which means they have to look back into the passage, which might not always be part of their process. Also on this test is poetry, which I can tell you by having worked for 1 million hours and currently working for thousands of hours with kids is not in their bailiwick. Why? Again, they test for poetry, but they don't really teach poetry. Also, you might notice, although your kids are developing into young adults, they are still quite literal. Poetry and literalness do not go hand in hand, but we're going to have to help them over that hump. The next part is the math section, which people get very excited about. There are concepts on there many students have not had yet, especially the geometry. But if they master their arithmetic and number concepts and they get through algebra this year with strength and clarity, they could still do very, very well. And then we just put the geometry right on top and it's not too difficult. And that is the basic breakdown of the SHSAT. So basically, as I sort of covered, it requires you have command of the parts of speech, basic rules of grammar, punctuation, usage, and knowing how to put together formally a paragraph and sentence. And again, that's not a strength of kids. Formal, they're all content at this age because you are their form, you are their structure. So this is the beginning of them learning that things are built a certain way. And the reading comprehension is the same way. We teach them how to read for theme and thesis, to understand what the point of the piece is, so that everything, then they can learn to see that everything from there derives from that point, the thesis of the piece. Till they learn to read with purpose, they're just kind of skimming, and we don't want that. On the math, you have to have those basic operations. There's no calculators. There's no calculators on any of these tests. So if they've been given calculators, they should put them away. It's horrible. In schools, they hand them a calculator in 7th grade when they shouldn't learn them, use them. And then in high school, they give them graphing calculators and they don't, when they need them, and they don't teach them how to use them. So it's all kind of ass backwards. So your students really, and we see this all the time, kids who are doing algebra and worrying about geometry and exponents and complex stuff. I go over problems with them and I see they're very awkward at long multiplication and division. So make sure your students are using their pencils. They also need some basic arithmetic concepts. They need their number knowledge, and then they've gotta get their strength up with the algebra. And as I mentioned before, there's a bunch of basic geometry that they'll have to know. And yes, they're going to have to memorize some formulas. It's okay. It's not hard. It's not a lot, but if they have a grasp of those and a command of those geometry problems will also be a lot easier, because the dirty secret of most standardized tests is the harder the concept, the easier the question. What do I mean by that? Another good question, Stuart. What I mean is, when you have a more difficult concept in, say, math, if most students see a difficult concept, they get scared and they're automatically out of the running for answering that question correctly. They just run away. So the few students who are left to answer a complex looking question, they need someone to get that question right. So they're not going to make a complex topic question also incredibly complex. So if your students learn to remain calm and not run away, they'll probably have an easy question for them. And what do I mean by remain calm? By remain calm, I mean remain calm, of course. Because when you don't remain calm, things happen. Words like calm become clam. Or you think the word clam is the word calm because that makes sense, because you're too wigged out to actually see what's in front of you. So that's what we stress for test process, and that's what we hope we can impart to your young test takers. SHSAT timing, again, you get 180 minutes, 3 hours, unless your extended time or double time. And as I mentioned earlier, you can start in any order you like. We have students try it one way or the other because they're all obsessed with finishing, but that really, and we spend most of our time disabusing of this notion. It's not about finishing. It's about getting more correct. And once they start rushing, they're dead, because you cannot do, especially math, you can't do faster, and difficult reading, you can't do faster. So although the time is a major issue for most students, and we certainly look to teach them to be more efficient, the first thing we teach them is how to play the notes right, and then we learn how to play the notes quickly. as I was speaking before, you don't need a great high percent. You don't need to get in the high 90s to get into Stuyvesant. But what's very important is that to know is that on each section of the SHSAT, you get a scaled score for each section. And each scaled section is out of 400 points. And the way the scale works is it ramps up toward the end. So the more you get right, the more each question is worth. So it's better on this test. Usually for most other tests, we look for balance. But on this test, we look for extreme excellence in one section and being pretty darn good on the other, as opposed to being very good on both. It just is how the curve works, or how it has worked. And below, I'll show you how it roughly works out, because no one's ever actually seen the scale. We've just kind of extrapolated and made our best guess over the years. So as you can see, I have not been lying. As of 2019, Stuyvesant's score for acceptance is 566, which is roughly, again, depending how your scale and how it breaks down, is roughly an 86% on the test, which is, shows you, first of all, how difficult this test can be, and second of all, that you don't need to be perfect on this exam. And if you go all the way down to the first school, on the first cutoff is 498, was Brooklyn Latin, and that's a 72%. And it progresses from there. So I really want to stress that perfect is the enemy of the good on this exam. You're striving for darn good, not perfect. Now, for those of you who might be considering the ISEE, here it's similar in a lot of ways. But it's just 4 sections instead of 2. But each section is scored separately. There's a verbal reasoning test section on the verbal, and a reading comprehension. The reading comprehension is pretty much the same as the SHSAT, maybe even a little easier. The verbal reasoning, though, that's a little tricky. That includes synonyms, for which there is not a lot you can do in prep besides learn vocabulary. And I don't mean memorize 1,000 words that all blur together on test day. I mean begin to slowly and thoroughly define the words you don't know as they pass you by, and build up from the various lists that are out there. We have some pretty good lists that we obviously recommend. Then there are sentence completions in the verbal section, which can be taught. They obviously have a huge vocabulary component, but because you're filling in the blank in the sentence, there's a lot more context to work with, and we can show kids how to work with that. In the math, also, it's very similar. There's section 2 is a section, and they're all multiple choice questions on this test. On the SHSAT, there are 5 math, what we call grid-in questions, where the kids have to come up with a number and bubble in that number. But here it's all multiple choice. The quantitative reasoning section on the math has a section called quantitative comparison, which is a vestige of one of the way old SAT forms, where you have 2 columns of numbers, and student has to say, is column A bigger, is column B bigger, are they equal, or is it not enough information to determine their relationship? And that needs to be learned, those kinds of questions, but otherwise the math is fairly similar to the SHSAT, but with one difference I will mention later. And then the second math section is called mathematics achievement. It's more less conceptual, and it's more, can you multiply with decimals, and can you do percents? More straightforward algorithmic math. Finally, on the ISEE, there is an essay, which does not pertain. It is included, but it is not scored. It is there presumably so that when your student writes an essay as an application to a school, they can compare it to the essay they wrote on the test. And if The essay they wrote in application to the school sounds like, Shakespeare, and the one they wrote on the test sounds like Cookie Monster, then maybe they had a little too much help on their application essay. The SSAT is similar and different because why have one kind of test? Why not have several different tests? And by the way, for the ISEE and the SSAT, there are upper, middle, and lower level versions of all these tests, which make it a lot of fun for us when we're assigning these. Your students will be taking the upper level of both or either. And on the SSAT, just to be different, the essay is first. Great. And then there are two math sections, and it starts with the math instead of the verbal. And they just call both sections quantitative, and they're exactly the same in terms of length and time. The verbal sections, again, they flip. You have the reading comprehension first, and then you have a staggeringly long verbal section, 60 questions, but only 30 minutes to do it. So you're not going to be perfect on that section for sure. And these tests, just like the SHSAT, are scaled. Nobody is perfect on these tests. You just got to be darn good. And we'll talk about what scores are good for this test after I'm done here. The thing that's different on this test is the analogies, which is also a vestige of the old SAT. They might have been gone already by when some of you guys parents took your SATs. They were on it when I took my SATs. I had to carve my SATs into granite. We didn't have paper back then, but the rest of you, it might have been gone. The analogies are like, dog is to mammal as, shark is to cartilaginous fish. Those kind of wonderful things that are actually very gameable. And I was an expert in tutoring them back when they were on the SATs. So we're delighted to teach your kids that then if they take this test. The ISEE is scored based out of, well, first you get one raw score point for each correct answer. Then you get a scaled score, and you get a percentile rank, and you get a stanine score. Most schools, I'm guessing, are either going to look at your stanine or your percentile or your stanine. You want to be, for most schools, 5 or above. For some of the crazy schools, and who knows with the increase in applications to private schools that's coming up, you might want 7s, 8s, and 9s, but those are all good goals. 5s and ups and 7, 8s, and 9s. SSAT is a rarer breed. Those you get a verbal score between 5 and 800 and a math score out of 5 and 800. But like the old SAT, this one you lose a quarter of a point for each incorrect answer. So no random guessing on this. All other tests, if you have no idea on a question, just pick a letter and move on, because you might accidentally get it right. Here, don't take a blind guess. Take an educated guess. If you have your answers down to 1 or 2 possible choices, that's worth a guess. That works out mathematically. But a blind guess does not. On the SSAT, we do recommend most students get above 700 on their scores for most of the boarding schools out there. And again, the essay on both tests are not scored. And that's it for all 3 tests. Oh my God. And how do they compare? As I mentioned, the math is basically the same except on all 3, except keep in mind that on the ISEE and the SSAT, older kids also take those tests. So they drop in some even harder random topics than they might into the SHSAT. Although the SHSAT has some random topics drop in now and then, which nobody should panic if they see it, because nobody else knows it either, so don't worry. Then that quantitative comparison section on the ISEE is a little different, and I should have added that the grid-ins on the SHSAT are a little different. But who cares? I mean, I care, but these are minor points. The math is essentially the same for all three, which is why you don't have to triple study the math in order to take one or more of these tests. The verbal, the big difference is that the ISEE and the SSAT have a big vocabulary component. And most kids are not behind the 8 ball on this, but most kids get a little smoked whenever they first take a practice ISEE or SSAT with us. So by all means, start learning the vocab now. As I said, don't memorize it, learn it. We'll talk about that later, or if you have questions about that, how to learn grammar, vocab. The SHSAT has grammar and editing questions that we spoke about, and the other two do not. And there's a greater variety of readings. The poetry we spoke about, you're not going to see on the ISEE or the SSAT, and they have readings with charts and data in them that you won't see on the ISEE or the SSAT. Now, Stuart, I've listened to this talk. I'm obviously at the start of this process. How do I prepare to deal with all these? What we usually recommend is that you start, if you're taking the SHSAT and maybe one of the others, that you start with the SHSAT. That will cover almost everything you need. But you should be doing that in conjunction with vocabulary. It's very important to start vocabulary yesterday. We offer SHSAT courses. We're starting one next week, which will be from really the ground up. If your student may have forgotten how to long divide or never really got comfortable long dividing, it might be good to start the long course, the SHSAT Plus we're offering. We have a wider variety of days and times for the spring. That course we always traditionally started after the state tests, and we're keeping our timing with that. They'll start at the end of April and the beginning of May. They end with the end of school. We give them a summer binder to keep them out of trouble, to keep you nudging them, and then it resumes after Labor Day. We also have summer intensive courses that are 2 weeks, 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. They're intensive, but they're not crazy. Most of our courses, all of our courses stress process, and so we don't sell hours by the pound. We don't make your kids endure, 6-hour boot camps every weekend. We prefer that the time they spend with us, they're engaged and learning and gaining experience and knowledge, and that their practice is efficient and effective. So we can get it done in that time frame, and we often do. We have about a 90% success rate, and we like to keep that up. Last but not least, if your kid's a little, likes that thrill of the moment, you could start in the fall. There's no shame in it. There's plenty of time there. You just can't mess around. You really have to work effectively if you start with our fall classes. This fall, we'll also be having ISEE courses as the demand has risen. More information about that as soon as I figure it out. And then, of course, we have one-on-one for all 3 exams. I haven't mentioned the Catholic school exams, the HSPT, or the TAX, but we do offer prep for that as well. And that, of course, is yet another option, and sadly, yet another series of tests. But we do prepare for all those exams, but those are one-on-one. And what's the best way to get started with all of this? Take a practice test. If you think maybe my kid has a shot, maybe my kid doesn't have a shot, he's fighting me, we don't know, we're nervous, take a test. It's free, it's only 3 hours, your head won't explode. Rachel will put it together for you in a minute, email you the test, email you the grade cam system we work with. All you have to do is register with us and tell us when you're finished so we know to process it. And then I will take a look. I will evaluate it in writing briefly, in addition to the diagnostic that our software does, and then you'll know. And if you need more help, I'll sit down with you. We'll do a little Zoom meet, 20 minutes, we'll talk, and I'll help you put together a plan. And that's all free. I want you off on the right foot. I want you to know what you're doing so you're not confused or exploited, and that your kid has the best chance to get into a good high school. And that, and remaining clam, is all we ask. So that, my friends, is the end of my presentation, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.